Ian, can you hear me? Just put your hand up, please.
Yes, I will meet Gordon.
Thanks.
Good evening.
Yep.
Can you hear me, Gordon?
Yes.
Good.
Good. You're the only one who should be unmuted, which is good.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. That's good.
We'll give it a couple of minutes, Bob.
Yeah, sure.
About 18 or 90 coming in through so far.
All right. Well, you've got your the Lodge Hope of Karachi Research Lodges spreading its wings far and wide. We've got you in Brazil now.
Even better.
And Missouri. The guy Tim Shaw's from Missouri. So
okay.
So yeah, in the next couple of meetings you might have even more.
We've had Australia, South Africa, Romania, US and Canada as well, Bob, over the last couple of weeks.
Right. Well, you might even get people from Peru wanting to join in, but they're a bit too late. So
fantastic.
Yeah.
Good evening,
what
Ben.
We should think. Sorry?
Israel, Bob.
Oh, hello, Ori. How are you?
Hi.
Are you in Israel just now?
Yes, and serious lockdown.
Oh, really? Oh, dear. Oh, well. Okay. Well, I'll drink yours for you.
No, it's okay. I'm doing very well. I'm fine.
You're supposed to say, okay. You're depriving a Scotsman, you know. It's not nice. Oh, dear. Oh, what's the weather like?
Oh, it's boring. It's wall-to-wall sunshine, 20-odd degrees every day. So, yeah, it's boring.
Yeah, it's pretty cold here, actually. 10, 9, 8 this morning, first thing.
And so I have, yep.
But you're looking well.
Well, it's not really. I'm going to have difficulty getting out the door when this thing finishes.
Oh.
Constant, too big for the door, I think. You know.
I know exactly what you mean. Somebody said in the paper the other day, a real wag, we're all only 2 or 3 weeks away from knowing everyone's true hair colour.
Absolutely. My wife's cracking up at the moment.
Yeah, I can't get out to the hairdressers. Well, I can't. I mean, I'm growing a long beard.
I don't have these problems, actually.
No. Well, it's a little bit of, it's okay in the winter, but in the summer it can be a bit of a problem. So you're keeping busy indoors, are you?
Just the usual thing, cleaning windows, cleaning out cupboards, you know.
Oh, well.
That's what one does.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay. Well, I'm glad that the camera's pointing at me in that case and not the rest of the room.
Bob, if I could just interrupt you for a second. Brendan, can I ask you that all your video cameras are on and that you're muted? That is one of the instructions from the new interim guidelines sent out by the Grand Master Mason, that the moderator has to be able to see everyone. Evening, Dad. Nice to see you.
Right, going mute.
But we'll just give them another minute and then I'll do a little bit of introduction and some housekeeping.
Sure. Okay. That was easy, wasn't it? That was easy. Speakers earlier, right? Because I tell you why. Yeah. He's got earphones in. They'll be from all over the world. They'll be from all over the world.
I'm just helping my dad out there, Brian, because he wasn't able to mute himself, but I managed to do it from this end. Because I can't really shout of him in public.
No.
But if you're wondering who he is, Brian, it's the one with the same surname as me. Well, Brian, good evening and welcome to the fourth Zoom meeting hosted by the Lodge Hope of Karachi, number 337. I think, Brian, we've created a bit of a stir because the Grand Master Mason has had to come out with some guidance over the use of Zoom. And I was particularly happy that at the weekend I was able to tell him what we were doing at Lodge Hope, and his guidance allows for us to bring in visiting Brian from not just our own province but throughout the rest of Scotland, and it's a delight to see Brian from all the arts and parts, and we've got North and South America and Europe represented from what I can see already. Part of the Zoom guidelines, Brian, is that we can record this, and I'm attempting to record it. The recording from Callum through the week, or last week, kind of failed. I'm trying to recover that just now. But you need to all be aware that I am recording this, and it will be on the Lodge Hope of Karachi Facebook pages. If you're uncomfortable with that, Brian, I would just ask you to leave. If you have got any questions for Bob, as you're all muted, I'd ask you if you can just send it in a chat to me, and we will have with your name, with your question, and I will pose those to Bob at the end. That way we're able to keep everybody on mute and ensure that the echo isn't there. We've got slightly longer in the 40 minutes. I've upgraded it through my work, but I'm still going to hold it to about that 35, 40-minute period, because I think if we go on longer, Brian, we might take away from the whole experience. And it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Brother Bob Cooper, Masonic author now, and his new guys on Facebook. Bob, I'd ask you to enlighten Brian with the second part of your musings on early Freemasonry in Scotland.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, thanks very much, Gordon. Very quickly, brethren, since we tried this first time round, it was a bit of a learning experience for me as well. And in the interim, I've had quite a lot of questions about me. So very quickly, to sort of introduce myself in case you don't know who I am, I have written several books and all the rest of it, which is probably why people seem to think I can talk. Because you can write a book doesn't mean to say you can speak, but hopefully I can do both. Very quickly, my background is as a historian. I studied classic Greek, not the language, classic Greek history, and then I transferred from Greek history to Scottish history. And so, you know, for the last 26 years, I've been working for Grand Lodge, and that's where my interest comes, where my interest in Freemasonry comes from, because we do have a very unique and very rich history of Freemasonry in Scotland, and one that frankly doesn't exist anywhere else. And not remembering exactly what I said first time round, I might end up repeating myself a little bit, so please bear with me. Some of what I've got to say you may well already know, but I'm trying to be all-encompassing here so that everyone who hasn't heard what I've got to say before gets all the information. Those of you who have heard what I've got to say before, my apologies if it's a bit of a repetition for you. But I think it's very important for us, as Scots in particular, to now come to realise that our understanding of the history of the craft is in fact quite wrong. And I don't mind saying that, even if I've got people here who won't necessarily believe me, because as a historian, I always have the evidence to back up what I've got to say. So what I'm saying is not opinion, it's based on hard fact, and thank goodness for our Scottish ancestors, because they were of a type that wrote everything down. Not just lodge minutes, but even the accounts can give you some tremendously interesting information. So we have a very huge amount of material that exists from before 1717. And that's the period I'm particularly interested in, because as you know, 1717 is the date that nearly everyone is fixated on for the beginnings of the craft. And of course, 1717 is the year that the Grand Lodge of England was founded in London. Although I have to say, recent academic studies have cast serious doubt on that date. It now looks like it was almost certainly 1721. That 4-year difference has a huge impact on our understanding of what was happening here in Scotland. And what is more, it has a huge impact on what the English were doing with our information. But I suspect that really has to be for another day, interesting although it is. So my interest, my historical interest, is all of Freemasonry, of course, but in particular Scottish Freemasonry before 1717. And I want to get away from the statement that we all probably know, and that is that purely speculative Freemasonry began in 1717 in London, England. Now, let's just think about what that means. Purely speculative Freemasonry. That is Freemasonry, modern Freemasonry as we know it, with no connection whatsoever to the craft of stonemasonry, began in 1717. Now, by making that statement, it becomes very clear that it is in many ways absolutely accurate. Purely speculative Freemasonry, and the word is purely speculative Freemasonry, began in 1717. That is, with no connection whatsoever in any shape or form with stonemasonry. And at a single sweep, we therefore have a situation where anything before 1717 is not recognised as being Freemasonry. Of course, as a good Scot, I would dispute that, and I will continue to dispute that on the basis of the information that we have here in Scotland. So this idea that purely speculative Freemasonry began in England 1717 ignores the fact that there were speculative Freemasons here in Scotland before 1717. And indeed, this idea that a stonemason couldn't be a speculative Freemason has got to be just so much nonsense. What that statement suggests is that a stonemason in Scotland building a castle or a church or whatever during the day, using the same working tools that he would then take to the lodge at night, couldn't be a speculative Freemason because he's a stonemason. But he's only a stonemason during the day when he's working. He's not a stonemason building something in the lodge at night. So what is he doing? Well, of course, he is speculating about the craft of stonemasonry. And that, for me, is one of the most crucial points that we constantly have to make to our English Masonic historians who, for whatever reason, can't seem to bring themselves to discuss anything that existed before 1717. So what is it that we have from before 1717 that makes me think this way? Well, for a start, it's just the sheer overwhelming amount of written information that we have. And of course, we rely primarily on the written records of lodges themselves, but we also have to remember there's a lot of written evidence from outside of the craft about people who are beginning to take notice about what lodges are doing, who they're admitting, and they're making comments about it. So it's not just what the stonemasons of Scotland were saying about themselves, it's about what other people were saying as well. So the amount of information that we have here is really quite staggering, and that's why this idea of speculative Freemasonry gets rid of all that, really is just a non-starter. So I'd like to maybe just very quickly explain to you what the kind of information that we have here relating to these early lodges. And we must admit right away that these very early lodges are lodges of stonemasons. They are not lodges of people like you and I. Well, not initially, at least. They are stonemasons' lodges, and only stonemasons could be members of those lodges. And the reason we know that it was only stonemasons is because of the lodge minutes. And these lodge minutes record who they are, not necessarily their occupation, but we are blessed with some external information about apprentice stonemasons when they joined the incorporation or the guild. So when you've got the incorporation and the guild membership records and you compare them to the lodge membership records, we can see that they're all, certainly initially, all stonemasons. But why would stonemasons start to keep written records? Well, it's all down to one man who I've mentioned before. It's time we did some serious work on this individual. I've already made a start. Who knows when it'll get finished, but we've made a start. And this chap is a chap called William Schaw. Now, William Schaw, we know a fair bit about him in general, not a lot about him in detail. And that's really what we need the research for, to try and work out who he was and what was motivating him. William Schaw was born 1550-ish. We can't be absolutely sure, but 1550-ish in Sochi, in central Scotland. And he very quickly was recruited by the royal court to serve as the king's wine waiter. So as a young teenager, as a very young man, he stood to the left side of the king, serving the king wine at dinner. However, apart from all that kind of stuff, he's very important to us because in 1583, so that makes him, 33 years old, thereabouts, he is appointed by the king to be his Master of Works. And as Master of Works, he had to look after all the kind of property that the royal family might use from time to time. So that included palaces, chapels, hunting lodges, all that kind of stuff. And so it was a fairly responsible job. William Schaw, therefore, was a civil servant. And I think that's important to bear this in mind. He never became an aristocrat. He was never knighted, but he was obviously very much admired. And we know that from the epitaph, which is on his tombstone in Dunfermline Abbey. Now, this man, well thought of, although he was, never became even a member of the minor aristocracy. He was just a faithful servant. And he's best known to us Masons today because he was the first person in the world, anywhere, to actually write down rules and regulations for the guidance of the stonemasons of Scotland. And these are known as the Schaw Statutes, 1598 and 1599. The date of each of these is very significant. I'll try and remember to explain why later. Both of these documents are dated the 28th of December, 1598 and 1599. Now, these documents, and there are quite a few examples, around about 6 or 7 copies lying around different places in Scotland. They were all written at his dictation. He had an office in Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, and they were dictated to his clerk, who then sent them to every known lodge in Scotland. And so this was, clearly there was a national network in existence for him to write to every known lodge in Scotland at the time. So as a civil servant, he was doing everything that you would expect a senior civil servant to do to make the workforce of stonemasons efficient. But when you read these documents, the first thing that strikes you is, well, these are just health and safety regulations. They're about keeping scaffolding secure, making sure that apprentices are looked after, that they serve their full term of apprenticeship. There's talk about money and all the rest of it. But underneath all that, there is another theme that's running. And this is to do with what we would now say to be esoteric or secret knowledge. And this is secret because it's not health and safety regulations that he's sending to these lodges. It's secret messages, things that you would expect people to know what to do because they are already in lodges. But things are, for instance, one of the first regulations is you will start to keep written records. And that is certainly why the first minute books suddenly appear soon after these Schaw statutes are issued. The oldest lodge minute in the world is owned by the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and it's the minutes of Lodge Aitchison's Haven, a very small place just outside Preston Pans in East Lothian. Doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. There's some stones, but not much else. But this lodge start their minutes on the 9th of January, 1599. So you can see that's a considerable earlier period than 1717. And they start to keep written records because William Schaw told them. Now, William Schaw obviously had a lot of influence and a lot of authorities, because you know what us Scots are like. Well, we don't really want to do that, you know, we never had to do it before, why should we do it now, all that kind of stuff. And he's telling them, no, you will start to keep written records. And this was always a bit of a puzzle to me, because looking at the records, we know that the guys in these very early lodges were mainly illiterate, or best semi-literate. So why would you ask illiterate people to keep written records? They can't read and write. Well, he had the answer to that as well, because he said, well, if you can't write your own records, so in other words, he wasn't going to let them off the hook. He wants written records, and no excuse was going to satisfy him. He simply said, right, okay, if you can't read or write, or you can't write your own records, this is what you'll do. You'll purchase a minute book, and every day after the meeting, or whenever, a week after the meeting, you'll find a lawyer, and then you will tell him what happened at the meeting, and he'll write it down for you. So there was no wriggle room for these early stonemasons. They more or less had to do what William Schaw told them to do. And you have to remember, William Schaw is their boss. He's the guy that's commissioning them to do work. And in fact, his signature exists today on multiple documents held in the National Archive, where he signs off money on behalf of the treasurer, the King's treasurer, for work that he had commanded be carried out. So, you know, if you were going to annoy someone, he was not the guy to do it, because you would get paid if you sort of really peed him off a lot. So he had the power and the authority, and that's why they did what he wanted them to do. So we can see from a very early stage what happens. William Schaw, as far as we know, was never initiated in a lodge. So he's not a Mason, but he's telling the Masons what to do. So he wants something from these stonemasons in Scotland. He wants a nice, efficient workforce, of course, but he obviously wants something more, because in these rules and regulations, in these statutes, as we call them now, he has given them other instructions. And one of the most interesting, and probably the most central one to mention tonight, is the instruction that he gives to every lodge in Scotland, that Every year, the warden of the lodge, the master of the lodge, is to take aside every single member of that lodge and test them in their ability to remember something. So this is a test of memory, and everyone has to go undergo this test of memory at least once a year. And the lodge must do that and record the fact that it's being done, although I think some of them get lackadaisical very quickly. But this is his instruction to them: test every member of the lodge in their ability to remember something. And this is crucial, I think, to our understanding not only of William Schaw and those around him, but understanding a bit about Scottish society at that time. You must remember, I think, that at the end of the 16th century, Scotland was a very gloomy place, not just weather-wise, but famine was very common. We were still burning witches for quite a long time later than that. Education was beginning, but it was rudimentary. And understanding what these stonemasons were doing was pretty much what we do today, despite the gloom and doom of those days. They were trying to understand the world around them, and they were asking the never-ending questions. Why am I here? What happens after we're gone? What's the purpose? All these normal questions that people ask today, they were asking as well. And the way they rationalized the world around them was through the world of work. The way they looked at their working lives during the day. They rationalized it and they speculated about it and took that to the lodge meetings at night. Now, clearly, William Schaw knew that what it was to be remembered was not just a word or a grip or anything like that. It was something quite substantial. He also clearly understood his fellow countrymen very well indeed, because what he did was, as part of the instruction for this annual testing, was the instruction to the lodge that for every point of failure, fellows of craft were to be fined 20 shillings and entered apprentices were to be fined 1 shilling. Now, if it was just one word, there would be no need to go into all that rigmarole. And you can see what he's trying to do. He's trying to get these Scots guys to do something they probably didn't really want to do. So how do you get a Scotsman to do what he doesn't want to do? Well, obviously you threaten to take money off him, of course. And so this is what he did, you know. He's saying, right, if you don't do what you're told, I'm going to make sure that you pay a penalty for every point of failure. So in other words, there are multiple questions being asked here. And if you can't remember them all, you can see the money totting up quite quickly. And so these Scots guys are going, oh, wait a minute, you know, I don't fancy having no money at the end of the week. And eventually, this is exactly what happens, that they do start to memorize. Now, unfortunately, William Schaw never explains what it is that he wants them to memorize. But let's think about this. He's instituted this fairly elaborate system of fines and an annual test of memory. Well, quite clearly, I would argue very strongly that this test of memory is a test of memory of the ritual. There's not really much other point in trying to memorize, I don't know, the rules of the borough you live in, or, you know, what the politicians are saying at the time or whatever. No, this is something he wants them to memorize, and what is more, to memorize it so to the point where they'll never ever forget it. Repetition is the secret here. The more you repeat things, the more it sinks in, and the more you never ever forget what it is that you're learning. This is why I think in Scotland we are unique, almost unique in the world, by our pride in being able to remember the ritual and deliver it from memory without the need to read it. I mean, I know some lodges, unfortunately, for whatever reason, now begun to read the ritual. William Schaw, 400 and odd years ago, didn't want that. He wanted it memorized, probably because they couldn't read and write. but that was not the point. It was to make sure that every single lodge in Scotland memorised the ritual, which implies there was only one, which will another topic for discussion sometime later. To finish off on William Schaw, we do know, unfortunately, that he died in 1602, and it seems pretty clear that he had plans for something else. I think he had plans to form a Grand Lodge or something similar, but he died too soon after the Shaw statutes had been written for him to implement any of his plans. So he would have been about 52 when he died, which is fairly old for those days, average age about 40, maybe 45. So he died a fairly old man, but unfortunately he died just at the point where the very next year, James VI, his king, James VI, who he had known for 30 odd years, the King James VI becomes King of Great Britain and goes to London in 1603. And so that kind of breaks the connection between William Schaw and the royal court. But what is going on in the royal court is, in my opinion, absolutely fascinating and perhaps crucial to understanding what's happening here in Scotland at the time of William Schaw. The English had spies, the English government had spies in the royal court, and the spy reports still exist. They're kept in the archive in London, and they report on the usual tittle-tattle that's going on when any group of people get together. Now, William Schaw is described as a master of the art of memory. Now, master means teacher in those days, teacher of the art of memory. So in other words, he was recognized as being a practitioner and a teacher of this technique known as the art of memory. At the same time that William Schaw is alive and active in the royal court here in Scotland, there are two others that the English spy also record as being masters of the art of memory. One is Dixon and the other one is Fowler. And the three of them are very close to the king. So if they're masters of the art of memory, it seems only reasonable that they were teaching their king this art of memory, this ability to memorize stuff. Without going into too much detail, basically the art of memory was a system of memorizing very large chunks of information that, of course, there's no books in these days. There's a very large piece of information that you can't write down, or you could, but you know, who's going to do it? Who's going to read it? So it's a technique that allows you to recall lots and lots of information. And so the English spies are not very happy, particularly with Dixon. They're all three are Scots, but Dixon is active in England. And one of the major practitioners of Hermeticism is an Italian by the name of Giordano Bruno. And Bruno comes to England and gives lectures at Oxford University. And Dixon is obviously quite taken with this man, and Bruno describes him as being his disciple. So here you have a disciple of Giordano Bruno, who unfortunately probably couldn't keep his mouth shut, was gabbing away about this wonderful way of looking at the world. Eventually they chucked him on a bonfire, and that was the end of him. So he was a bit indiscreet. But what I'm getting at here is this system of thinking of viewing the world that was born in the Italian Renaissance transmits to Scotland through the likes of William Schaw, Dixon and Fowler. How are we doing for time, chaps?
Well, we've got another 5 minutes anyway. I think if everybody can nod their heads in approval, maybe even stretch it to 10 if everybody's happy.
Okay, right. So that's the story so far about William Schaw. Looking at what William Schaw is trying to get these stonemasons of Scotland to memorise, and of course it is initially, as I said, stonemasons, but very soon after our guys are trotting down with a minute book to see a lawyer, you can imagine, I can just imagine in my mind's eye what's happening. This secretary, call him a secretary if you like, takes his minute book under his arm, off he goes to the lawyer's office, says, I want you to record what happened at last night's meeting. And the lawyer says, oh, sure, I can do that. Yeah, tell me. He records the names of the initiates and who did what and what bills were paid, all the rest of it. And eventually the lawyer sort of gets, well, this sounds really very interesting. How do I join? And the lawyer secretary says, well, sorry, you can't join. You know, you're just a lawyer. You know, you're not a stonemason. You're nothing special. You know, you just, charge people money for writing things down, But the lawyer is one of these persistent types. Well, I quite fancy joining this, And eventually the secretary gets fed up being mithered by this lawyer. He goes back to the lodge and he says, look, guys, this lawyer that we've got writing our minutes is turning into be a bit of a pain. Every time I see him, he's asking me, how does he join the lodge? And I keep telling him he can't join because he's just a lawyer. Well, the lodge says to him, are you mad? You must be absolutely mad. Of course he can join. Once he's a member, we don't have to pay him for writing the minutes for us. So, what happens? A lawyer joins the lodge. Okay, now the cat's out the bag, isn't it? Because every Thursday night, the lawyer's off with his wee briefcase and he's going away, and his fellow lawyers say to him, where are you going? You go away this time every week. Well, I can't tell you, you're not a member. Well, but we're lawyers, we're all lawyers together. But it's not for lawyers, just for special people like me, special lawyers like me. And eventually they sort of gang up on him and he starts to, and that's what happens. And we can actually see this from the written records where people who are not stonemasons are slowly admitted to these stonemasons lodges. And because they're not stonemasons, there's a big problem. Apprentice is an entered apprentice, typically when he's 14 years old. He serves 7 years before he can become a fellow of craft, which means that he can move around the country. But an aristocrat or a lawyer or whatever isn't going to put up with being told, well, come back in 7 years and we'll give you the second degree. That's not on, is it? So that's why the stonemasons have a 7-year gap, but these lawyers, etc., they get all the degrees available all at the one time. And that causes a big argument in these stonemasons lodges. How is it that someone who's not a stonemason joining a stonemason's lodge gets all the secrets when I'm a stonemason and I can't? Well, the answer was a typically pragmatic Scottish one. Well, son, don't you worry. We made them pay handsomely for the privilege of getting the 2 degrees all in the one night. And that's what happened. So, and I have to say, something else that's important is that these aristocrats and lawyers, etc., they didn't just join, get the secrets and clear off. They actually came back. They came back frequently until war broke out, and that kind of caused all sorts of problems. But they were regular attenders. Now, what an aristocrat has got in common with illiterate stonemasons has probably got more to do with the nature of Scottish society at the time than anything else. But anyway, to cut a long story short, the memory system now transfers not just from stonemasons, from Schaw to stonemasons, but from Schaw to stonemasons to aristocrats. So it begins to go full circle. So Scottish society has got this very interesting melting pot, this stew, this Scotch broth of all sorts of elements that covers from the lowest in society to the highest in society, probably even involving the king himself. So what is it that William Schaw is so desperate for them to memorize? Well, to cut it very simple, very short, I think he was desperate for them to remember the ritual because they couldn't write it down. And we are blessed again in Scotland by having the oldest Masonic rituals in the world. And we're also equally blessed by the people who wrote them down took the time and the trouble to date the documents when they were writing them. The oldest one is the Edinburgh Register House manuscript, dated 1696. The next oldest is the early manuscript from 1705. The next one's the Chetwood Crawley manuscript from circa 1710, and there are others around that date. The reason I'm interested in these particular rituals is, of course, because they all predate 1717. So together with the minutes, together with the commentary of people who were not members of the lodge, the commentary of aristocrats who joined the lodge, and the existence of these rituals, all from before 1717, means, as far as I'm concerned, there's a huge amount of information here that simply proves that Freemasonry, as we now know it, began here in Scotland in the very late 16th century. Hope you found that interesting. Okay.
Bob, thank you very, very much for that. There's 2 or 3 members of my Mother Lodge are watching you this evening, and I think they'll be at me about the art of memory and encouraging me to practice it, I think. We've got a couple of questions. Ori, I'm going to come to you first. I'm going to unmute you. So, Ori,
Oh, I'm unmuted.
Yeah. Great. So, Ori, you've got a question for Bob.
Bob, talking about the art of memory, is there a place for the art of memory in modern ritual, the ritual we use today? I'm referring specifically to the Montefiore second degree ritual, which you probably heard.
Yes, is this one Charles Winston? I was tinkering with. Yeah, I think there is. I mean, in my opinion, what's happened is that, and this touches on what I was saying about the foundation of the Grand Lodge of England. It's really a big separate subject, but very quickly, we memorized the ritual. The English were the first to print it. And of course, once it was printed, everybody assumes that that was the earliest ritual. But we used the art of memory to memorize our ritual. And I would go so far as to say that the technique employed was choosing an appropriate building on which to base this system of memory. And of course, the one that was most familiar to stonemasons of Scotland at the time was King Solomon's Temple.
Does that answer your question, Ori?
Oh, well, yeah, sorry, to finish it off. Basically, what happened, of course, was because we were remembering it and the English are printing it, then they started adding all sorts of elements to it, elaborating it, and adding all sorts of things. That's where, for instance, the hoodwink appears. All sorts of other things start appearing after it appears in England. And I'm quite convinced that layer upon layer has completely obscured the original Scottish origins of the ritual.
Okay. Bob, we've
Sure.
got another question from Ian G. If the lodges did not follow the instruction to keep the early minutes, was there a penalty for not doing so? And if so, who saw this penalty carried out?
All right. The short answer is that there was no penalty, but you've got to remember that that period, there was only a very short period between Shaw writing those instructions and him dying. So that's why there's ideas that he was going to create a head office, a Grand Lodge, to enforce his rules and regulations, but he didn't live long enough for that to happen. I have to say, though, that every lodge that received a copy of the Shaw statutes, or most of them, we'll not go to killing just at the moment, but most of them who received the Shaw statutes obviously recognise their importance, and that's why we've got so many copies, because these lodges actually glued them into the first minute book that William Schaw had told them to buy, and they still exist for that reason. So even although William Shaw is not around, they are still abiding by his regulations. There was nothing about them breaking the rules as a lodge. It was down to the individual brothers.
Okay. We've got a question from Bob Potter. How did Shaw get along with the burgesses and incorporations, especially in Edinburgh?
He's like a lot of people. I mean, you've got to remember William Schaw was what we would probably call a Renaissance man. He had his own views. This is a period not long after the Reformation. It's now nominally a Protestant country, but there was still a large number of people adhering to the old faith. So William Shaw's to tread a very careful line. And there were problems with the Burgesses, because depending on who held power, from one to the other, whether it was ultra-Protestant, moderate Protestants, or even cupboard Catholics, he had to, as I say, sit on the fence a lot of times. But he was very clever. Remember, he had the ear of the king, so he had a lot of protection in comparison to others.
Okay, thanks, Bob. I've got another question here from Kim Parkin. Does the art of memory in its original form still exist?
Well, it does, although the art of memory began in classic Greek, and very quickly what it meant was this technique allowed people to imagine a building, to walk through the building in a certain way, going upstairs into rooms, looking at certain objects or paintings or whatever, and these objects in certain, the building was the book, the room was the chapter, the objects were giving you the page. And if you could remember the route that you would walk through, mentally walk through in this building, you would then be able to remember the book that you're supposed to be delivering orally to your client. The art of memory, I forget the question, Kim, sorry, what was it? I got carried away there.
Does the art of memory in its original form still exist?
Oh, yeah. The nearest that I can make out that still exists it's now called mnemonics, and it is a similar technique, but I don't think anyone who is good at mnemonics would ever be able to remember the Iliad or whatever of Greek times. But the best I can come up with at that is there used to be a guy on television maybe 20, 30 years ago called Brain of Britain. And he would sit there and people would phone in with questions. And I think he had something like, if not 100% record in repeating the answer or getting the answer right. He was like 99.9% correct. And he uses a very similar technique to remember this vast amount of information. But it's not the same as a book, but it's similar.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Brian, well, that's us coming on 7:45. Just a couple of things from me to round up this evening. On behalf of the Lodge Hope of Karachi, can I thank you all again for your attendance this evening. Next week we have Brother Geoffrey Tolman, who's the Grand Steward, the Provincial Grand Lodge of North Yorks, so from the UGLE sort of Masonry School, and he's going to talk to us about an initiation ceremony and the festive board from circa 1745. So we're jumping ahead 50 or so years from where Bob's talking about just now in Scotland, and I think that will be a nice sort of yin and yang between what Bob's telling us about the truth in Scotland and maybe how our brethren in England portrayed it down south. And I can see you putting your thumbs up there, Geoffrey. So hopefully some of what Bob said to you may ring true with you. I think the recordings worked this evening, Brian, so I will be trying to put that up this evening, and you're more than welcome to share it or invite your friends and Brian to come to the Lodge Hope of Karachi pages. I've got a guest speaker for 2 weeks this evening. I'm just waiting for him to confirm. But if he is available, it will be another special evening, as it has been with Bob this evening. And following that, we've got Brother Rab Craig. Many of you will know that he's the Provincial Grand Chaplain in Glasgow. And for a man of the cloth, he's got some brilliant banter, but maybe that's because he was in the engineers for a lot of years before he became a minister. And he's going to talk to us about Freemasonry under the jackboot in the Channel Islands during the Second World War. So once again, Brian, can I encourage you to sign the virtual tile on our Lodge Facebook page? That way we can keep a record of it in our actual minute book to say how many were along this evening listening to Bob. And Bob, on behalf of the 75 plus 80 Brian that were here this evening, can I thank you once again for your knowledge that you've shared with us this evening. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Brian.
Bye all. Bye-bye.
I will unmute you all now, Brian, so you can rise.
Well done, Bob.
That was for the
Enjoyed that very much.
ceremony, and then
Thank you.
I think it was a 4-course dinner after it.
Wait for a dram now.
Oh no, that's on hold. Everything's on hold.
There was a lot going on. I turned away for a second, but I saw. Excellent, Don. Once again, Bob. Thank you. And you, Gordon.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you. Thanks for
You
listening.
too, mate. Take care. Stay safe.
Bye now.
Hello. Thank you, bro, Brad.
Cheers, guys.
Oh,
Thanks very
hello.
much once again. Super nice.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and see you again.
Cheers,
All right.
Bob, it was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, bro, Bob.
Good. Thanks for tuning in. All right, Claudio.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's you, Bob.
You
You can put your feet up and have a wee dram.
All right. Bye now. Bye-bye.
Thanks, gentlemen. I'm going to cancel this in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good evening.
Good evening.